10 years ago, Dundee was the yes capital of Scotland, with more people here voting for independence than in any other Scottish local authority. But a decade on, what now matters most to people in Scotland's fourth largest city? Let's find out. Welcome to Debate Night. Debate Night is the only show in Scotland that gives you the chance to put your questions to the people in power, answering them on our panel this evening. Entrepreneur and businessman Callie Russell. Callie is a graduate of Dundee University and the co-founder of Unfolded, a company which aims to create zero-waste fashion. Callie is the only person to have appeared on the BBC's Dragon Den twice and turned down investments on both occasions. Scottish Conservative MSP for North East Scotland and party spokesperson for Net Zero, Energy and Transport, Douglas Lumsden MSP. Douglas was a former co-leader of Aberdeen City Council and spent over 20 years working in IT before entering politics. Also with us tonight from the SNP, Michelle Thomson MSP, previously an MP and former spokesperson for Business, Innovation and Skills. Michelle started her career as a professional musician. She then worked for over 20 years in companies including RBS and Standard Life before entering politics almost 10 years ago. Michael Marra is the Scottish Labour MSP for North East Scotland and the party spokesperson for Finance. Born in Dundee, he previously worked at the city's university. Michael joined the Labour Party as a teenager and was picked as one to watch at the recent Scottish Politician of the Year awards. And finally, author Emma Christie. Born in Cumnock, Emma previously worked as a journalist at the Press and Journal. After leaving, she became a celebrated crime writer, with her debut novel being shortlisted for the McIlvanney Prize for Scottish Crime Book of the Year and Scottish Crime Debut of the Year. Please welcome them all to Debate Night. And of course, welcome also to our studio audience here in Dundee. It's great to be back with you again. And you can join in the discussion from home. BBCDN is the hashtag you need to debate along with us on social media. Give us a follow as well at BBC Debate Night. And our podcast will be available for you to download straight after the show. We've got a lot to get through tonight, so let's go to our first question, which comes from Linda Graham. Linda, good evening.
Given the alleged missed opportunities to apprehend Emma Caldwell's killer, can the public have confidence in police investigative procedures?
Linda, thank you. This is an absolutely dreadful case. Police Scotland have apologised for failings in the original inquiry into the killing of Emma Caldwell. Her killer was jailed today for 36 years. That's the second longest sentence ever handed down by a Scottish court. Now, Emma's family have said she was failed due to a toxic culture of misogyny and corruption. Michelle Thomson.
The first thing I would say is that I can only extend my heartfelt sorrow to the family of Emma Caldwell, who today will have got some relief from a terrible situation where I know they fought for years and years, because she was a beautiful, bright, vibrant young woman, and to have her life taken away in such tragic circumstances, I can only put my sympathy on the record. Absolutely dreadful. In terms of your question, can we have confidence? Now, I agree with the family. Clearly, there was misogyny at play. Clearly, she was not given the investigation she should have got because of her circumstances. Completely unacceptable. Her life was worth very much indeed. It was worth a great deal. However, can we have confidence? Yes, I think we can have confidence. We look back, it was 19 years ago today. I myself, I remember as a young woman being in the receiving end of a great deal of misogyny, blockers in my career and so on. And I would like to think that the world has changed, that Police Scotland, although it was, of course, Strathclyde before that, has changed as well. So, yes, I do have confidence, and thank goodness they've come straight out today and said they apologise. And I know there will be internal investigations, and that can only be the right thing.
Is that enough? Does there need to be more than an internal investigation into this?
I think we should allow the internal investigation to do what it needs to do in the interim. The question, perhaps, is, are there other cold cases such as this where there was the same underlying misogyny at play. But at the moment, and I think today it's important we recognise that due to the fight of the family and also the journalist, I think, was it Samantha?
Sam Pauling.
Pauling, yes. All credit to her in 2015, conducted the interview with Ian Packard and put the steps in motion to arrive where we are today. So I think today we should be extending our sympathy to the family. There's clearly questions to be asked of Police Scotland, but I do have confidence in what they do. They're very robust and thorough, but nobody could take away from what a terrible situation for the family.
Indeed, indeed. Let me hear from the audience on this. Lady in the back row.
I was just curious if it's found that, obviously they've admitted there was failings, and if it's found that the police officer who was at the lead of the investigation, who's now a knight, or has been knighted, should he hand back his honour?
OK, thank you. Let me just hear from a few more people in the audience. Man in the glasses, there, yes.
Would you say that, like, we've lost trust in the police due to the lack of community policing? I mean, Police Scotland said that they were going to stop investigating minor crimes that have no investigative leads. Does this affect the lack of, like, public,
Yeah, that was another story this week based on a pilot project in Aberdeenshire, actually. And gentleman just behind you in the blue sweater as well.
Do you think it's right, though, that it's an internal inquiry, the police investigating the police? Surely it should be an external to investigate.
Emma Christie, what do you think? Police investigating the police in this case, is that appropriate?
I think the public needs to know what's going on, and I think any investigation that is undertaken, the public needs to know exactly what's been happening and what steps are being taken to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I think touching on what the gentleman said about the minor crimes issue as well, you know, the police are saying they could potentially stop investigating minor crimes. You know, I think if that's going to happen, we need to know that the major crimes are going to be dealt with much more efficiently. I don't think you can take away from the minor ones without absolutely ensuring that the major ones are taken care of, and for that we need answers and we need to know what's happening behind the scenes.
Gentleman on the third row. Yes, on you go.
Yeah, just touching on the investigation, just watching Catching a Copper on Channel 4 a couple of weeks back clearly showed that internal investigations didn't work, and in fact the IOPC wasn't fit for purpose. So I wonder again if there's going to be another alternative body that might investigate that, knowing that the IOPC, for example, aren't fit for purpose.
I know we've got serving police officers in the audience this evening, so I'd love to hear your reactions to this. Michael Marra, can we have confidence in the police on the basis of this case? There were 32 other charges against this man, more than 20 other women involved when he was on the loose.
And the second longest sentence ever handed down by a Scottish court, I believe, to him today. And thank God that that family have got some justice at last. I think I read today that it was Emma's father's dying wish. He said to her mother on his deathbed, you know, please get justice for our daughter. So thank goodness that has come to them. So I think on this issue about the confidence in the police, clearly I think there's going to be more to come on this in the coming days. Thank God in this as well for an investigative press, I have to say. The compliments to that journalist, but actually journalists that can pursue these issues over many years and still having some of that capacity left in our journalism in Scotland makes a huge difference. So I think that there will be more to come in terms of from the press in the coming days. I think the questions that are asked about the balance, and what's important in this is about trust and the public having trust in that investigation and feeling that they're hearing the answers that are right and proper. I would say that too often at the moment we're seeing these issues come up, and I would draw the comparison to whether it be the El Jamel inquiry in Dundee for people who have been butchered at the hands of this rogue surgeon, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital scandal in Glasgow, and the Horizon scandal, three very recent issues that we've talked about in Parliament, but we've talked about in cafes and to our families. That this is about institutions that are not accountable and that are not serving the public appropriately. And too often in Scotland, I think still, there are people who are prejudiced against, and Emma has found herself in one of those categories as somebody who has been vulnerable and has been denied justice.
Is Police Scotland not accountable? Is that what you're saying?
I think in this case it's clearly not been accountable enough. And we have to ask questions. We have to make sure that the public can have trust. So it has to be a robust investigation. If that requires external help in that, then that should be applied.
Okay. Lady in the very back row. Yes.
So yes, I am that serving police officer. I was in the police for 30 years and I investigate serious crimes. And I have to say, from this time I joined the police to the time I left, 30 years, absolutely chalk and cheese. They did learn, they do investigations, you do see people investigating better and learning from mistakes. So to compare what has happened 20 years ago to what happens now, I think is completely unfair.
And that question that was asked by Linda, can the police have confidence in police, can the public have confidence in police investigative procedures? You would say?
Absolutely, yes, because constantly they're looking at every inquiry to see where changes can be made, where we can make improvements, and it absolutely does happen on every investigation.
Douglas Lumsden.
Yeah, I think as a dad, I can't imagine what that family have gone through over all these years. It is good to hear that the police service has changed, but for me that's a good reason to have a full public inquiry to make sure that lessons have been learned and to make sure that things like what we've witnessed today could never happen again.
So what do you think are the lessons that we can learn from this? Because the allegation from the family is misogyny and corruption.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's why we need a full investigation to see if that's still endemic within Police Scotland. Hopefully, what we've heard from the audience, that's no longer the case. But let's, we can't have a police marking their own homework. Let's have a full inquiry so we can actually see for ourselves that that is no longer the case.
Okay. Gentleman in the black top there. Yes, on you go.
I think it's prime example of Police Scotland having total disregard for victims and their families within certain parts of society in Scotland. I think if Emma had been somebody more high profile or had done a certain job and things like that, or had been a bit more high standing and within society, I think the investigation and the crime would have been dealt with completely different.
Thank you. Lady in the glasses down here. Yeah.
I think, I agree with most of what's been said tonight, but I do feel that maybe it's time to look at Police Scotland in a different light and maybe introduce more regional situations rather than the whole of police being Police Scotland, because this is where things can get missed and that there's certain things that will go on in one region and not in another that police may not have the full hold on. So I think that it's possible to start looking at a different way of policing again. I mean, I know we've not long made it Police Scotland, but I do feel that that's kind of lost its way a little bit on the ground, for ordinary folks, not being accessible, not being available, and I really do think that we need to start thinking more regionally again.
More distant.
Yes.
Feels more distant now. Callie Russell, the question is, can the public have confidence in police investigative procedures? Terrible case, this.
I think it's truly horrible, and I can't imagine what that family's gone through for that period of time. I don't think any of us in this room can imagine what they've gone through for that as well, and I hope no one ever has to go through that ever again because of failings from individuals in that process. I think it's right and proper there is a thorough investigation, and an investigation that is open. Whether that is internal or external, I am not the expert on that and will not suggest which way it should be go for it, but it needs to be open, it needs to be clear to everyone. There was a woman at the back there at the start who said about taking away a knighthood sort of thing. I didn't know that fact, but if that's the case, then 100% that should be taken away. I think so often people can hide behind titles and privilege, and that cannot be acceptable.
Thank you. Your views on everything you hear tonight, the hashtag is BBCDN on social media. Let's go to our second question of the night, which comes from Ros Langlands. Ros, good evening.
With obesity on the rise, particularly in children, is it not time we looked at expecting parents to take educational responsibility rather than potential proposed cure of banning meal deals in supermarkets?
Thank you, Ros. This is a public consultation launched today by the Scottish Government on potentially introducing restrictions on supermarket price promotions for products that are high fat, salt and sugar, ready meals, for instance. Buy one, get one free, that kind of thing. Michael Marra.
Yeah, I think that there is a balance to be struck, absolutely, between making sure that parents are helping to give as healthy a diet as they can to their children. Unfortunately, for many families, that's just not possible because the unhealthy foods are the cheapest foods. And when people are not able to actually afford those foods, and there's many places in Dundee which essentially are food deserts, where you can't actually get healthy food within a reasonable walking distance of where you would want to go. So the stuff that is promoted in whether it be the local supermarkets or otherwise, and takeaways is actually the cheapest stuff. It's high calorific value and it's more accessible to people. So we do have to think about the socio-economic side of this, about the restrictions that people have.
So it's right for the government to intervene on
I think
this?
it's absolutely right that the government looks at this, and we have to think about how that's done. I think we've got a big problem in our food system generally, I have to say, in terms of the way that these products are the ones that are pushed to the front of big food businesses nationally and internationally. And we have to think about what we can do to make cheaper, healthier food available to more people. Part of that is about education, it's about cooking, it's about actually eating with our families. You know, I don't really want to be in the position, I'm not generally in favour of banning things or getting into those situations, but you know, people who want to sit down at the weekend, have a bottle of wine with a ready meal that's there, I can understand that. The challenge though in this is to make sure that always the cheapest option, and at times when bills are so incredibly high, isn't the least healthy option for people. And we need to actually work with supermarkets and retailers to do what we can to make that happen.
Douglas Lumsden?
Yeah. I was just going to say that food's only part of it. You know, exercise is another important thing. And when we have, you know, local councils being strapped for cash, and we see swimming pools closing, we see, you know, football pitches closing, then that's a big part of it as well. I remember being a kid, you know, I was probably out playing all the time and always active. But that's more and more difficult for our youngsters now. So, yes, look at food, but let's look at getting them active as well and see what facilities there are for people to do that.
Ros, you asked the question. What do you think of the replies so far?
Well, I was a PE teacher, and I do agree that we really need to encourage the children to get out and play. But I also disagree that all healthy food is more expensive, because there's lots of things that are ready meals, and they're way more expensive than buying nice vegetables and making soup and all sorts of other recipes. And I do think it comes down to laziness sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, there are whole parts of the city where you just can't get access or ready access to healthy foods in terms of soup and vegetable. Yeah.
Have vegetables on special offer.
For which you have to have access to a car to get to the public transport in Dundee is so poor you can't get a bus to almost anywhere, frankly, to get to the supermarkets unless it's in walking distance. I think that I would say that on the balance in terms of weight loss and obesity, 80% of that sits with food rather than around about the 20% that sits with exercise. Yeah. If you're putting the wrong kind of fuel into your body, that's going to be heavy saturated fats, heavy salts, it's incredibly difficult to exercise that off. You're right, we have to get more activity, but we have to deal with that food issue.
Latest figures, 2/3 of Scots overweight, 20% of Scottish children at risk of obesity. Man in the blue and white striped shirt, yes.
Yeah, I was saying that museums across the city, we could get in for free. I would rather pay to go into these institutions and the museums and have the swimming pools and gyms open free for younger ages that could go in and exercise.
Thank you. Lady with the glasses there, yes.
I feel as though we should be supporting the people that are using the food banks first before we are judging them on what they're actually eating.
Man in the check shirt.
It's easy to put the onus on the individual, but we're marketed, all these things are through social media, through YouTube adverts, we're constantly marketed this junk food. A lot of recent studies have shown that junk food is actually extremely, like ultra-processed foods are extremely addictive. There's an addictive quality. Once you get in that cycle, it's so hard to break it. It's so easy just to go kind of comfort eat rather than go and do an exercise. And I think that's a big part of the issue.
Thank you, thank you. I'll come back to you in just a second. Michelle Thomson, what do you think on this? How much intervention should there be from government?
The appropriate amount, and hence the consultation. I mean, it's asking the question, because I think everything that the audience has brought out this evening, they're all excellent points. We recognise that various stakeholder groups in our society have a role. Parents, educational establishments, all the people that help shape people's lives. We can't be too heavy-handed because people have freedom of choice, but we also are quite aware that some of these foods are very, very bad for us. And as the gentleman pointed out with the red check shirt, they're addictive as well. So I think it's a good thing that the Scottish Government is consulting on this.
And where do you sit on it? Where do you sit on it? Do you think we need restrictions?
I'm wary about restrictions, but at the same time, we have a health crisis, and particularly with young people, that we would like to do something about, which is why I said the appropriate balance. So it's a sensible thing to do, to consult. Ask people the question, because we know we need to do something about that, but we also know it's a complex problem to fix. It's not just in Scotland, it's across the whole Western world. This is really difficult, and there's a whole variety of factors at play.
Thank you. Man on the end here, down here. Yeah, on you go.
Shouldn't there be a ban on the junk food before a certain time so that it can help us out to eat a bit healthier? What do you think, pal?
What, so advertising junk food or eating junk food?
On the TV, I mean.
On the TV. On the TV. Well, we can talk about that in just a second. Man in the blue shirt and the jacket down here. Yes, on you go.
I worry sometimes about consultations because inevitably people on either ends of the spectrum have the loudest voices in these situations. But I have to say to Michael, I don't know the last time you used buses in Dundee. I could criticise Dundee City Council for a lot, but the bus service in Dundee, right across the city, I think is excellent and gets people around very easily.
It's the most expensive bus service in Scotland. The mile along the Perth Road is the most expensive mile that you could take anywhere in Scotland. The numbers have collapsed post-COVID, a real difficulty, and many routes have been taken off. I have to profoundly disagree. I use the buses at least 5-6 times a week in Dundee, and I think it's a service that's declined markedly.
Fascinating as Dundee buses are. Let's try and stick with obesity at the moment. Lady on the end there, yes.
Yep. Well, I would say in terms of the effects, COVID probably played a lot in the last couple of years. Students were inside, young people were inside, and we didn't really go out that much. Yes, there was the casual walk here and there, but I feel like that had a major impact in terms of community buildings and exercising together and, you know, dealing with health altogether. I feel like that played a massive impact in how we go about our day-to-day lives, in terms of how we look at food, in terms of how we look at different marketing from our phones, the different social media platforms, and all of that used it against us, I would say. But what do you think is the way forward to get people more into these community spaces, to exercise together, to encourage health altogether?
Good question. Callie Russell.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think what we're actually talking about here is the starting place is a very unfair fight. Whereas on one side of it, junk food companies, the advertising, the promotion that goes into these things is a very easy way to attract people into them. The example that I would give is the Prime drink last year, where you had KSI and Logan Paul, where their kids are ripping stores apart looking for this drink. I don't love the idea of kind of like saying we can't do something, but we're in a situation where clearly the status quo isn't working. So I think it's very fair and right for us to talk about other ways of doing things, because if we continue down this path, that will continue. It will get worse and it'll get worse and our health will get worse. What do I actually think the answer is? I think the answer is a mix of everything that we're talking about here. I think it's an answer about us educating young people at a much earlier age of the dangers of these foods. I think the answer is, how do we get them to go out and be active and engage in different ways? I'll be really honest, PlayStation, Xbox, these things, that is hard to compete with if you're a local community centre, no matter what you do. But all of us have a role to play in that, of showing people different ways. I play football twice a week. It is the best thing that I can do for my mental health and my physical health, okay, that kind of comes through to it. We need to encourage that behaviour, and I think as society, that's up to all of us. It's not up to just government, it's not up just to politicians, it's not up to people just sitting on a panel, it's up to all of us to have those interactions and show people there's different ways of doing that. That's not to lecture, but that's just to encourage.
Right, let's find out what the audience think. Man in the front row.
I think you've got to link the cost of living crisis to this as well. I know you mentioned about the fruit and veg is generally cheaper than the ready meals, but if you're struggling to pay your gas or electricity bill, you might have no choice but to take the ready meals because they're quicker to cook and convenient.
Yeah, totally agree.
Like I said, just with regards to the cost of living crisis and the energy bills, I think that's a main thing that hasn't really been thought of in this so far.
Thank you, thank you. And man on the front row with a blue sweater.
I think we're making a good point that the ready meals are generally cheaper than eating more healthily. But if we ban that and restrict that, what are people on lower income supposed to eat? You know, because if we restrict it, then they don't have access to foods that are affordable for them.
Is the consultation not, though, just about meal deals? I know we're talking a lot about ready meals, and I think that's a very different thing, and I think it's well worth pointing out the difference between that. The consultation is on fizzy drinks in particular being coupled with meal deals and that same sort of piece that kind of comes through to it.
Yeah.
I think ready meals have a very important place in society, and the cost of living point that you made there is absolutely vital. That has to be taken into account.
And it's specifically high fat.
Exactly. I think that's the really important part of this that we can just sometimes get dragged away from.
Right. So when it comes to regulation, Emma, where do you sit in this? Whether it be regulating advertising when they can be shown these foods, or how they're sold in supermarkets, how much should it be individual choice, and how much do we need regulation?
I think it's a hugely complex issue, and I think these headline grabbers, you know, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to ban meal deals. I think it's a sticky plaster over a massive problem, and I think it makes it look as if we are doing something when actually the core problems are not being addressed. If we want people to be healthier, we need to stop shutting swimming pools. We need to keep sports facilities open. And I know you commented that, you know, you said, I think 80% is the food we eat and 20% is exercise. I'd like to know where you got that statistic from, because I think it's a package. It needs to come together. And I think in Scotland we have culturally a lot to learn. You know, I spend a lot of the year living in Spain, and I find it much easier to be healthy in Spain than when I come back to Scotland. I've been home for a month at the moment. And it is difficult to, if I'm in a hurry, to try and find a healthy snack, a healthy meal. And it's, you know, spending the same money in Spain, I can get it very easily. And I think there's so many different levels. I think schools need to have healthier meals and better education. And I really think that it's very easy to demonise obese people. It's very easy to demonise the parents of obese children. And I think, you know, demonising and blaming is not going to get us any further forward. We need to look at the culture, look at the education, and take steps to improve it.
Thank you. Your views on that from home, we'd love to hear from you. Hashtag is BBCDN on social media. We're in Dundee tonight. Next week, we're going to be in Inverness. The week after that, we will be in Dumfries with debate night. So if you'd like to come along and be part of the audience for any of those shows, there's the address on your screen. Just click on the link and we'd love to see you there. Let's go to our third question of the night, which comes from Gary Jordan. Gary, good evening.
Hello. Audit Scotland have said this week that a significant service transformation is required to ensure the financial stability of Scotland's health service. What reforms would you suggest to save on the current costs of our NHS without compromising on patient safety and further driving up patient waiting times?
Thank you, Gary. BMA Scotland called this report from Audit Scotland staggeringly bleak. No overall vision for the future of the NHS and unable to meet growing demand, said Audit Scotland. Michelle Thomson.
I think it's a great question. I think we all recognise that there's significant challenges with the NHS in Scotland, the NHS in the rest of the UK. We know that there's been increasing demands over a long period of time. We also know that Neil Gray, who's the new Cabinet Secretary in post, is going to come forward with a plan for that. And he's a very good Cabinet Secretary, and I'm confident he'll do that.
What should that be? He says he's going to give us his vision. What would you say it should be?
For a start, I don't think that we should have so many health boards, for example. We've got lots of layers of management. We need people on the front line. We need more people on the front line. We need less managers. We need more use of technology, for example. Now, that's expensive to implement, but tech is so important and it should be used much more extensively in the NHS. But it will take brave, bold decisions. And we also have a role. So, for example, the chair of the Scottish BMA has said we need to have a national conversation. He's absolutely right. We all need to have a national conversation, a sensible conversation across political parties about what can we do to still provide a very good service. We all value it so much, but recognise some of the significant constraints, the fiscal constraints that the Scottish Government has are very, very real, and we've talked to them a lot during the Scottish budget, but we've got to have sensible conversations about what we do.
Does that mean, Michelle, that the NHS won't be able to do everything moving forward in Scotland?
I would say so. I think we need to look at that. When we say do everything, we've got a clear priority call about what we value most. what needs to be tackled more speedily. And maybe arguably there are some things that those of us who are able to do so might be willing to pay for. But I make a clear distinction about the people who are not able to, and there's certain types of things that absolutely, regardless of where you fit, need to be tackled, and they're the really difficult health ones. But we need to look at this properly. It's a big, big challenge. And to say, you know, for any political party to say, oh, this is an SNP problem, this isn't an SNP problem. This is a Scottish problem in the Scottish NHS. It's a big problem elsewhere in the UK as well with our NHS. It's a big problem.
It's a big problem in England, it's a big problem in Wales as well. Man in the glasses down the front row, yes.
My first job was at the NHS in 2002, and the buzzwords then were agenda for change, but it just sounds like the same inefficiencies are there still. And the SNP have been in power for a long time now. Why should we listen to you now?
I'll come back to Michelle. Let me get some more views. Man in the grey top.
Yeah, I think the thing that doesn't get talked about is the fact that there's been a complete shift over the last 20, 30 years from a society where taxation was at a decent level to fund proper public services. I work in public service, work in local government. I've seen it over the past, I've worked in there for 30 odd years. I've seen cut after cut after cut in funding and funding levels and pay going down, etc., etc. The health service is just the same, and we see tinkering and changing and stuff like that to make it all try and cost less. Yes, obviously there's advancements in medical science and in IT, etc., that can make things work more efficiently. But the bottom line is we are underfunding these services. We're not prioritising as a society. We need to change the whole tax and spend system back to a situation where people are paying sufficient taxes to fund decent services that can look after people, and that's going down the tube rapidly, and we need to turn that around.
So, on that, should people be prepared to pay more to fund the NHS, to get the service required moving forward with an ageing population? Michael Marra.
Well, when the Parliament was established back in 1999, in the first few years of that up until 2007, we proportionally spent significantly more of our budget on health than we did in the rest of the UK. And part of that's because of the long-term legacy of poor health in this country. We knew that we were, at those times, called the sick man of Europe in terms of our health record. That's disappeared. So the SNP have brought our health spending down to the same level as the rest of the UK. So that gap that was there, we were strategically investing and trying to deal with some of these issues, and that has disappeared completely. We now have a situation where we have 1 in 7 people in Scotland on a waiting list, and we're sitting here asking questions about whether people should have to pay. The NHS is an idea that will exist for as long as there are people who are prepared to fight for it. And that is a community health-based system that's based on need, is based on the common insurance of all of us as a community that we care for each other in that way. And that's what the NHS represents. And I think we should fight for it, frankly.
So this is about more money. It's not about reform.
So we have to do both. We have to reform the way it's worked. Part of we get into the health economics of this, we have a collapse in the amount of money that's spent on technology. That's a point I would agree with Michelle on. That we see that across the UK because other countries have continued to invest capital in their technology and the ways. We've got a hospital in Dundee now over 50 years old in 9 Wells, which is creaking at the edges, which can't actually provide the kind of modern health care that we need in this country. We have to get back to the point where we're investing in it strategically rather than cutting it. And the misery that people are finding themselves in day to day, it has mental health impacts, it has people living in chronic pain. It also means that we've got an economy that's suffering as a result of it. Our NHS is key to all of this, and we have to save it.
OK. Gary, you asked the question. You used to work in the NHS, didn't you?
Yes, I was an A&E staff nurse, and I've moved into education. I'll be quite interested to see what Neil Gray has to say about the vision, because the last nursing vision was the 2030 vision, which was published in 2017. Since then, there's been huge amounts of transformation. We've went from 43,000 whole-time equivalent nurses to 64,000. We've got nurses in more advanced roles, so you're now seeing more advanced nurse practitioners, advanced care practitioners. They're taking on these complex roles that we can't fill with doctors who are waiting for pay restoration. Where do we stop? I mean, I'm now a nursing lecturer, and we've increased the student nursing placements year on year. It's the 3rd year in a row where we're not recruiting as many as we did the year before, so these spaces aren't being filled. Where do we stop? Do we just keep hiring people into these roles to the point where we just completely collapse?
Callie Russell, so many pressures out there. The one thing we do have is technology, growing at an incredible pace within the NHS. Is that the best hope for the future?
I think a lot of times people say technology will save us, and they just say the word technology. And behind that, you actually have to think, well, what is there actually there? Sort of thing. Like, it's all very easy to say we can become more efficient if we use more technologies, if we do X, Y, and Z, but what are these technologies? Can they be implemented safely? I think there's two things on this, and listening to everyone. First, I'm not a politician, and everyone's got their own point on it, and everything that kind of comes through to it, and their own reasons for how they express those points on a subject like the NHS. But, you know, my family have had experience of the NHS over the last kind of 12 to 18 months, and I must admit, the level of care and the level of service that they've received has been absolutely phenomenal. And I think sometimes we forget we forget that care and that support is there for people, and we get stuck on the numbers and we get stuck on reports like this. That isn't to say that it can't be better. It isn't to say that we can't improve and that we shouldn't be striving for improve. But I think sometimes we've got to really remember those positive parts that kind of come with it. To the second point, and specifically around technology, I think so much of this, from friends that work in the NHS, there's so many layers now of management, and there's so much kind of things that they have to do to be allowed to do their jobs. And they find, you know, one of my friends who's now moved back to Ireland, who worked at the NHS, she was eventually driven out of it because she found that the amount of time that she was spending with actual patients compared to the process of managing the patients was massively out of skew, and that she felt that she wasn't able to give that same sort of service. So when I look at it, is that fundamentally I believe the NHS should always be free. I think it's one of the things that makes this country the country that it is. And I think all of us should fight for that, and I think all of us should appreciate that, and I think all of us should do as much as we can to support that in any way that we can through our healthy choices and the points that we just talked about. But secondly on that is I think we need to look at the organisation as a whole and how you change big organisations. I want to stress a point is I've worked with some of the biggest retailers in this country, and I've tried to fundamentally change their business models. These companies are tiny compared to the size of the NHS. Reforming and changing organisations like that take huge amounts of time, huge amounts of resources, huge amounts of passion from everyone around it, and actually everyone pulling in one direction. And sometimes we will still get things wrong in that process, but if we believe in it and if we set off in that way, we will eventually get to the right way, is my thoughts.
Thank you, thank you. Lady on the end.
Yeah, I totally understand where people are coming from, and I'm so glad that you had a wonderful experience with the NHS with your family. But that's not always the case, and we have to be realistic about this. We have to have some really tough, realistic conversations about where we're failing people. To go on from the previous, I attend Tayside Adult Weight Management Services, and I've had to go back to them because of medical problems. And 5 years ago, they were still giving the same stuff out as they are today. And even the people who are offering the service and, you know, doing the classes are basically saying it's woefully outdated and inadequate. And that ties in with what we were talking about previously, about people struggling with their weight issues, people trying to get healthier and trying to do the best they can. But it's not just that. I know it's multi-layered, I know it's a massive, great big tanker to turn around, but I think it's time now that Scotland sits up, takes notice, and really gets to grip with this problem, because we do have an ageing society, and if we don't get this right, we are in deep, deep problems for the future.
Thank you. A man with a black top. Yes, on you go.
I think the main issue with the NHS in Scotland, but not just only Scotland, but the whole of the UK, is staffing numbers, recruitment, and also mainly retention. I think you could throw as much money at the NHS, and I think money will always be there to an extent. But if you don't get enough people to see patients and can do operations, then it's always going to be on its knees and it's always going to struggle. And that's why when you go A&E, you're waiting all day to get seen, or you're waiting months, if no years, for an operation, because there's just no staff to do the work.
Which takes us back to Brexit, where we often end up on this programme as well. Emma, you mentioned you live in Barcelona. I don't know what your experience of the health system has been over there, but do you think we expect too much of the NHS here now?
I think I'm not sure that we expect too much. I think there's a great affection for the NHS, and rightfully so. I think it's you know, a fantastic institution. I mean, you look over to United States, for example, and the healthcare that, you know, everyone has to pay for everything. I mean, it's horrendous. And I think the NHS provides excellent care in emergency situations and cancer treatment and such like. But for every story you hear of that nature, you do hear about the people in trolleys, in corridors, not getting operations and such like. So what can we do? I mean, the question originally was, what do we need to do to reform it? And as yet, no one's really sort of come up with any suggestions. You know, we need more money. So where does the money come from? I mean, could we consider some members of society paying for prescriptions? For example, everybody loves free stuff. But if I'm middle class and I'm earning plenty of money, why do I get a free prescription when it could go to someone who's needing it? The same could be said, and this is potentially more controversial, but for example, when I go to see my GP, we all have seen the figures of how many thousands of appointments are missed every day. If there was a small charge, like £2, £3, you know, the price of a meal deal to some members of society, you know, if you're means tested, you've got enough money to pay £3 to go to see your GP, would that suddenly create a whole lot more money? Maybe, and I know it changes fundamentally what the NHS is about, because the NHS is free at the point of care. But maybe we've got to the stage, if our NHS is bleak and completely, you know, inefficient, maybe we've got to the point where we need to say, well, can we look again at this, and can the people who can afford to pay make those payments so there's more services and better services for the people who cannot pay it?
Well, we keep being told we need to have a big conversation about this. Is that the kind of thing we need to look at, Douglas Lumsden?
I think we do need to look at everything. I think there is more demands on the NHS. I think we all understand that. People are living longer, medicines are more expensive, and that's not going to shrink.
So what reforms do we need? That's what the question is.
I do think there is a part of modernisation, and that goes back to maybe the GP appointments missed. You know, why, for example, you're not getting a text message to remind you that you've got a GP appointment, so then you don't miss it. But yeah, I think you've actually got to we've got to look at some more basic things. It's actually tricky to get a GP appointment. You know, I don't know if you've tried lately. So if people can't see the GP, then there's going to be a bigger amount of people going to A&E instead. So it all has a knock-on effect. So I think we have to get some basics right, which is be able to see a GP. And in terms of A&E, it's, you know, I had a bad experience by my father last year where he was 8 hours waiting in an ambulance outside the A&E to get in. So that means that ambulance can't go to get someone else. So there is some basic changes we need to look at, and then also look at a larger reform.
OK, back to the audience. Man in the blue and white striped shirt, yeah.
I think a big problem is millions are spent on agency nurses, where if wages and conditions for nurses that are within the NHS are withheld and improved, then a lot of nurses would be retained and they go elsewhere. And also, I'd love to ask Michael in particular, if Labour administration was to come in, would you increase taxes, cut funding elsewhere, or borrow to improve funding towards the NHS? Because just now you seem to...
Briefly, Michael, respond to that.
Certainly. So what we said is that we'd, across the UK, would scrap the non-dom tax status, and that would deliver significant investment into the NHS. And in the UK, Labour, we have committed to doing that in England and Wales. That's going to be spent on waiting lists. We've matched that pledge in Scotland, so with the extra money that will come in, will be attributed to trying to bring some of those waiting lists down. And that's absolutely key. We have to make sure, and we know that by, I think it's by 2050, that over 50% of the revenue in Scotland will have to be attributed to the NHS on current trajectory. So we want to find ways to make sure that we can get more funding in. So there are ways like that, closing tax loopholes, making sure that we can get more money in so that we can actually pay for the services that we need.
OK, your suggestions, hashtag is BBCDN in social media. I know we've got a lot of hands still up, but there's other things we want to talk about this evening as well, and lots of questions around this area. Question 4 tonight, which comes from Chris Scott. Chris, good evening.
Hi, good evening. In view of Labour's interference in the Gaza ceasefire opposition debate and the Speaker of the House bending the rules to ensure Scotland's voice is once again not heard in Westminster, is it time our MPs came back to Scotland to focus on winning independence?
Thank you. Well, that's Chris's view there, Labour's interference in this debate. Michelle Thomson, you've been an MP. Should our SNP MPs be coming back to Scotland to focus on winning independence? Walk out of Westminster on this?
wait a minute, let's look at the position that happened here. The big standout for me was the clerks of Westminster putting a letter in the public domain. Now, if you've been in Westminster, as I have, and indeed in the Scottish Parliament, you don't see much of the clerks. They're highly skilled, highly professional in all these arcane rules in Westminster, less so in the Scottish Parliament, about what is the right thing to do, what's the legal position, what's the precedent. Now, the clerk in this particular incident made it quite clear there was no precedent for this, and so much so he sought to put it in the public domain. So clearly, I believe that Lindsay Hoyle, as Speaker's position, is untenable. The private meetings with the whips which the clerks were sent away from. Now, in terms of your question, Stephen Flynn in Westminster, who I think has been doing a super job in trying to get people's voices heard of the disgraceful things that are happening in Gaza, he's made it quite clear that they have to represent everybody in Scotland, not just people like me who absolutely want to see independence. And whilst people vote for SNP MPs and we're not independent, he says that MPs should still be there, and I agree with him. But that doesn't remove from the fact that this has been quite a disgraceful episode in Westminster, and the way that Lindsay Hoyle promised a further debate to the SNP as the third largest party and then retracted it. Utterly disgraceful.
Should he go?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Chris, you asked the question.
Yeah, I feel like it's not the only time that our voices have been silenced, and I think it's not going to be. It's going to be silenced again, and I just feel now is the time for us to actually get back home and concentrate on running our own country.
Michael Marra, can you understand why the SNP are so annoyed about this, effectively being cut out of the process by Westminster as they see it?
Well, I've heard how annoyed they are. I've seen the media coverage. I've heard Stephen Flynn talking about this at some length. I think that Michelle knows the detail more than I do in terms of the way that these procedures work in Westminster. I've never been there in terms of being elected to Westminster. So I think what has been lost too often in this is that the UK Parliament has now voted for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. It said that we should be delivering humanitarian aid into Gaza.
But that wasn't the SNP motion.
No,
it wasn't.
It wasn't the SNP motion, but the Parliament voted for it. And I think that the reality of this is, there are people, tens of thousands of people, losing their lives in the most horrific circumstances. And too often, I think, in this debate in the last couple of weeks, there's been too much of that has been lost. I understand there is that discussion that people want to have. That's about actually those rules and whether people feel that they are heard or not in that process. But I think the most important thing is that we make sure that, there's a loud, clear message that we need that ceasefire and it has to happen as soon as possible.
Douglas Lumsden, can you understand why the SNP and SNP members are so furious about this?
No, I think no one came out of it well last week. I think it came across as a complete shambles. And I don't think Labour's interfering behind the scenes was helpful either. So I can understand the frustration. But and I think the biggest concern for me is that we're actually talking about what happened behind the scenes as opposed to the situation in Gaza and Palestine. I think that probably the biggest issue that we should be talking about.
Yes.
Not the goings on in Westminster.
Emma Christie.
I have to say that I feel the use of the word disgrace needs to go to everyone in the chamber that day, because the focus needed to be Gaza. I understand there are rules to be followed and such like, but 1 week later, we're still debating, he broke the rules, no, he broke the rules, I'm sorry, but since then, how many children have died in Gaza? I would say that. And in terms of do we walk out of Westminster, my feeling on that is we've got to be in it to win it. If you're not in the room, you're not going to be part of the conversation. And I feel it's absolutely fundamental that there is a voice heard in Westminster. I live in Barcelona, and we've got a similar situation with the Catalans and the Spanish government. And what is so important in that situation as well is that the voices are heard. Not only that people get a chance to speak, but that they are listened to is absolutely key.
Gentleman in the back row, yes, on you go.
It would have been possible for the SNP to get that motion through if they had just slightly tweaked the phraseology and it presented a more balanced picture, because the fact is it was designed to embarrass the Labour Party. They recognised that Labour has a problem historically with their anti-Semitic position, so it had to be more balanced in their wording. And the SNP knew it and exploited it. And that was the only reason why that motion didn't carry, because it would have got Labour support otherwise.
And just three along from you, there's a lady shaking her head there. On you go.
Yeah, I completely disagree with that. Considering that SNP used 2 of their 3 opposition days to push for a ceasefire in Gaza, and my original point why I raised my hand was, we're talking about how many children died from the point where the SNP walked off the floor. What if Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer had called for a ceasefire 2 months ago? How many children and women and men would have been saved then?
Callie Russell, the original question is it time our MPs, SNP MPs, came back to Scotland to focus on winning independence?
I don't think it's democracy means being involved in interaction with it. What happened the other week from a political and a democratic standpoint is, I'm sorry, it's just appalling. Like, do you know what I mean? It's taking away the chance to have that vote. Michael said the Parliament sent a clear message. Parliament didn't send a clear message because at the end of the day, people walked out anyway. It wasn't a united front. They didn't vote through that same sort of point, so that didn't come across. The thing around this, and we've all touched on it, is that we're talking about processes. The reason why we're talking about processes is because we're not tackling the main issue. Like, the thing that you just said there is so unbelievably true. Why is it taking the 3rd biggest party in the UK to bring this time and time and time again? Why are we not standing up for it?
Michael Marra?
Yeah, I think that the Parliament voted in the end. There was the Parliament's process. It has moved on significantly in the last couple of months. I think the lady at the back is right. You know, I would have liked us to be in a position where we were calling for an immediate ceasefire a lot earlier. I'm glad that that's the position that the UK Parliament has taken now. The reality that I'm particularly interested in is what that actually means on the ground. And, you know, yes, we have to actually push diplomatically, internationally, to try and make sure that we get that aid in, that we work with partners both in Palestine and Israel to try and help them to solve the issue as it goes on. It's hugely complex, but we need to make sure that as much as possible that we can speak with one voice, try and find the common ground. And I think that that is what we need to do politically. Parties need to try and find a common ground rather than trying to pull apart and find differences.
If I now go back to Chris, he's going to burst on this.
Michael, in the last vote, Labour abstained on the ceasefire. Most of Labour abstained on the ceasefire. So they didn't actually come together and do that.
And as I said, I'm really glad that that has moved on in recent weeks. And
but this was only a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, I'm saying, and the vote that came this week, the motion that was put on the Labour Party called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, it increased the aid, it wanted to actually talking about a two-state solution in the region. So, that's absolutely critical.
So on that, Israel have fundamentally said they're not going to have a two-state solution. You cannot force something that the Israelis don't want to do. And the second point. Sorry, I'm just going to push you on this. The second point is only a few months ago, or a couple of months ago, your leader was on LBC stating that they should cut off the water and they should cut off the power to the Gazans. That's your own. Okay. That's your own.
Fundamentally, we cannot as Britain force anybody in this region to do anything. We have to work. Frankly, in the long history of this, that's part of the problem. What we actually have to do now is work in open dialogue with both sides in that. And I can't give up on the idea of a two-state solution. You know, I don't think any of us should, because it's the only way. You're right, the Israeli government are opposed to that position and the leadership of it, but there's many people in Israel who believe in it fundamentally, and we have to be good partners to them too.
Well, we'll see if talks for a ceasefire do move forward over the course of the next few days. Right, the last few minutes of the programme, we're going to do something different tonight. Debate night is 5 years old this week, and since we lodged, well, a lot has happened. Brexit, cost of living crisis, the pandemic, political upheavals at home as well. 4 Prime Ministers, 2 First Ministers. So since it's our first birthday, and since it's my birthday today as well, I get to ask a question tonight. What is the lesson of the last 5 years for all of us? I'd love to hear from you on this as well. Michelle Thomson, what's the lesson of the last 5 years since this programme launched?
Stand up and be counted. It will be no surprise to any of you that I'm a passionate independent supporter. And what that means for me is making our voices heard, getting the governments that we vote for to implement the policies that favour our people. Now, we had a chance in 2014, we weren't successful, but since that day, I've made it my absolute life mission and guiding mission to make people's lives better. And going back to your earlier questions, sir, we have a job to persuade people that it's normal to run your own affairs, that it's normal to get the government you vote for, and that it's normal for them to implement the policies you're in
lesson
favour
of
of.
the last 5 years. Don't give up on independence. All right.
No,
Douglas Lumsden.
go for it.
Briefly.
I would
Briefly.
say the lesson of the last 5 years that maybe Michelle should take on is actually to run the country properly. That's what you're elected to do.
No, what's your lesson?
And that's easy feat.
That's why we keep getting elected.
Michael Marra, lesson of the last 5 years.
I mean, we need to get rid of Tory Prime Ministers and all of that. I mean, I think what we saw in the last week of the last Tory Prime Minister just out the door 18 months ago, standing in front of a room, including known Nazis, talking about deep state conspiracy theories, shows how utterly bankrupt the Tory government has become, and the Tory party, divorced from reality, utterly appalling. We need to get rid of them, and we need to try and unite the country with a better vision about what change can be.
Emma Christie, lesson of the last 5 years, 30 seconds.
Let's get back into Europe, I say.
Yeah.
Callie Russell, lesson of the last 5 years for you.
Quite liked Emma's one, but I think maybe my own one would be to challenge the status quo. Like, a lot of the things that we've talked about here have resulted because the status quo isn't challenged, and we don't try to innovate, we don't try new things, and that's often done because we have a fear towards them. Challenge it, try things differently. Sometimes they'll work out.
OK, tight for time. Lesson of the last 5 years. Man in the black top.
On a more civil note, I think the lesson of the last 5 years is Scotland's as divided as it's ever been. And also it's in the worst state economically, and our public services is the worst it's ever been.
Well, that's because of Westminster.
Thank you.
It's
Man with the glasses there.
macroeconomics.
Lesson of the last 5 years.
Bring back Guy Fawkes.
One more quickly, the man in the grey top on the front here. Lesson of the last 5 years.
Strike, strike, strike if you want better standards of living.
Well, no consensus there, but thank you very much indeed for that. That's it for tonight. We're back with you next week. We're going to be in Inverness. You can come along by applying on the website there, and the week after that, we're going to be in Dumfries. If you missed any of tonight's programme, we're repeated a bit later on BBC One Scotland, or you can watch it any time that suits you on the BBC iPlayer, of course. Thank you very much to my panel and a brilliant audience here in Dundee this evening, and to you at home for watching. We'll see you next week. In the meantime, from all of us on Debate Night, stay safe, stay well. Good night.